This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
The following program is part 2 of 2 parts, each 90 minutes long. There is support material available at this website, including quizzes, handouts, and lecture outlines for all presentations. Consult the UCTV programming guide for the date and time that other lectures in the series will be shown.
Talk about some of our favorite garden insects and how to manage them with an integrated pest management program. And this one is a real popular one. Do people know what this is? Aphids. Right. Just about every plant species seems to have at least one aphid species that gets on at one time or another. And they're very common garden pests, very well adapted to our growing environment and to our various plant species, cultivated plants. Aphids, the aphids look similar often, but most aphids actually are fairly specific to the plant species that they feed on. So the aphid that's feeding on your tulip tree isn't going to move over to your crepe myrtle or onto your apple tree. They're all different species of aphids. In the vegetable garden, there are some aphids like the green peach aphid and the melon aphid that do go on a number of different vegetable plants. But generally, particularly on the woody ornamentals, there are different species for each plant. So you don't have to worry about them taking over the garden and moving from one plant to another in most cases. Aphids are really very they seem simple, but they're very well evolved pests. And I spent quite a bit of time with aphids. And they're usually pear-shaped organisms. They have antennae. They have these little things coming out of their backside called cornicles, which is distinctive of aphids. Some have shorter cornicles than these. Aphids as adults sometimes have wings and sometimes don't have wings. And that's because they're very efficient with their resources. They only grow wings when they really need them. Why waste good energy that could be used on reproduction with wings if you don't need them? So when the food quality gets bad, when the aphid populations get dense and they're rubbing antennae, then they grow wings when they molt into their adult phase. Otherwise, they tend to be mostly wingless. The other thing that's very energy conservative about aphids is that for most of the year they're an all-female race, and they give live birth to little aphids which are virtually clones of themselves. So this is very efficient because they don't have males out there not reproducing on their own. However, when wintertime comes and the leaves fall off the trees, they're saying, yikes, we can't survive this dry spell unless we're an egg. And eggs are the overwintering stage. And somehow the aphids sense through nutrition, day length, perhaps weather, that fall is coming on, the leaves are dropping off, and they produce a generation of males and females, mate, lay eggs, and so they lay the eggs on the bark of the tree, and they can overwinter until spring comes, leaves start flushing out, the females pop out of the eggs, and everything's hunky-dory for another season. Aphids like to feed on rapidly growing terminal growth. This is what we see in our rose bushes. They're not on this older rosebud, they're on this rapidly growing terminal, and they like that lush growth. Remember we talked about how if you put a whole lot of nitrogen on, get a lot of vegetative growth, you get a lot of aphids. and they really reproduce fast. Up here you can see the shed skins of the aphids where they've molted. Often, if you've successfully controlled aphids, you still have those shed skins on there, and people are thinking, what are those? They're still there. Well, they're just the skins of aphids. Don't worry about them. The shed cuticles. The best way to manage this situation really is to go out there on a daily basis and knock them off. The good thing about aphids, or one of the good things about aphids, and one thing to remember, is that aphids are really a mild season pest. They come in the spring and they're gone. Most species of aphids are gone by the time it gets really hot in June. And so often, you can tolerate them for 4 or 5 weeks. The other thing is that aphids don't injure, they don't cause life-threatening damage to woody plants. What aphids do is they bother us because they produce honeydew, and they're sticky and they're ugly, and then there's black sooty mold that comes on over the honeydew, which looks ugly. But aphids don't kill trees. So if your tree is covered with aphids, it's sort of part of the process there. It's not going to hurt the tree. If you want to manage them, you're not managing them to protect the tree. You're managing them to protect your own sensibilities, which may be legitimate, but put it in perspective. To reduce aphids, with an integrated program, there's a number of different approaches that you can take, and you should probably try several of them together. You can prune out the infested leaves and stems, try to keep on top of them in the early part of the season, knock them off with shaking or water. You can protect seedlings with row covers or caps. Aluminum foil mulches. If you put aluminum foil in a vegetable garden, the reflection will actually repel the aphids. They won't land there to reproduce. Encourage natural enemies, many natural enemies of aphids. And if the aphids get bad, use insecticidal oils or insecticidal soaps in the case of herbaceous plants. Break, I was talking to somebody about the people in the cities who have street trees that they have to manage when the aphid honeydew gets on cars and it's intolerable. There's a new product called imidacloprid or merit, which is being used. It's a soil injection, has to be applied at least a couple months before the aphids become a problem. It's taken up through the roots of the tree and goes systemically through the plant, and is a good management, does provide good management of aphids. Imidacloprid is a lot safer for people and natural enemies, especially when it's a soil injection, than many other alternatives, but it's still not completely environmentally benign, and I wouldn't recommend it except where you really need it, and probably just in a professional situation like that. Conditions favoring aphids: lush new growth, nitrogen, pruning. When you kill off natural enemies with insecticides, you get aphid problems. Ants, we talked about ants. Mild weather, and then certain hosts. When you plant a flowering plum tree or a tulip tree, you are planting aphids. And that's what you're planting. Crepe myrtles too. I mean, you can rely on all these plant species to produce aphids. And that's great. I like tulip trees because I love lady beetles. And there's a number of tulip trees around the city that I regularly visit in the summer because they're covered with lady beetles, because they're covered with aphids. Unfortunately, the city is not treating them. But and I can remember way back when, a long time ago, when they had that Cordy Brothers down there across from Executive Airport, and they were planting trees in the parking lot. And planting trees in the parking lot is a good idea because it shades your cars. But I couldn't believe they were planting tulip trees in a parking lot. I mean, that's nuts. Everybody knows it produces aphids and honeydews. There's other trees that you can use which you're not going to have that problem with. Another landscape design problem. Even among plants that we know have aphid problems, there is considerable variation. And we were doing some research in the Davis Rose Garden, well, back now, I guess, but we noticed that there was great variation in terms of the rose varieties and how many aphids they had. So for instance, this yellow line and this spotted line here, which are Tropicana and sheer elegance varieties of roses, had very high aphid populations. On the other hand, Angel Face and Brandy down here, they didn't have nearly as severe aphid problems. And so you may notice this in your garden, that certain of your roses are having more problems. So it's worthwhile, you know, studying that and perhaps planting more of the ones you don't have problems with. Natural enemies, biological control. Aphids have lots of natural enemies, and they will come in if you have high populations. This is a tomato plant that was covered with aphids, and the aphids are gone. All you see there are the white shed skins of the aphids that are gone, that had molted. But we do see who took care of this problem, lady beetles. This is the convergent lady beetle with the converging white marks on the thorax there, and then the larvae of that lady beetle really came in and cleaned it up. And this again, this is the convergent lady beetle. This is really the most common lady beetle in California, and really my favorite lady beetle because of its life cycle. It has these converging markings on it. This is the larvae. Again, it has three pairs of legs in the front off its thorax. This one's a little bunched up. I think it's ready to pupate. Eggs. It's good to get to know what the eggs of pests and beneficials look like. This is part of your monitoring program, which is part of your IPM program. You know, you're out there not only looking for pests, but looking for evidence that the biological controls are moving in. So lady beetle eggs, usually this shape and laid in groups. The pupae of the convergent lady beetle. And this lady beetle, this convergent lady beetle species, and again, there's many, many species of red and black lady beetles in California, and probably about 6 of them are quite common. This convergent lady beetle probably the most common. But it is pretty neat because it's the one that you see in these huge aggregations up in the mountains. If anybody seen those, they would be many yards wide, many yards deep, usually in the foothills or the mountains on the coastal ranges, usually near a creek, somewhere where they can get some water. As we were discussing before, aphid populations really go down when the heat comes in about June. Now there are certain aphids that are heat-loving aphids. You see the crepe myrtle aphid, for instance, in the summer, but most of the aphids are spring aphids, and so there's not as many aphids after June, and the lady beetles, short on food, start going up to the mountains. You'll see lady beetles down here in the valley all the way up to about November 1st. But their populations are gradually being reduced because there's not that many aphids, and they're going up to the mountain to spend the summer and the winter. And so they're up there as adults in these big aggregations. They're not feeding on aphids. They're all adults. They're taking in a little water. They're probably doing a lot of mating. And then in March, when the temperatures start getting warm and the aphids start popping out here in the valley, they catch the winds down to the valley and feed on the aphids and have several generations down here.
Do the adults overwinter?
It's the adults. It's only the adults who are up here. Yeah, after about November 1st, you can't get them to reproduce. I've tried. Really hard to get them to reproduce, even in the laboratory. I don't know exactly what's the trigger there, but it's complicated. And they're very hard to rear. So they would be they're hard to rear, but they're easy to collect. And because there's these huge mounds of them, there's all these people who make their living collecting lady beetles and putting them in little packages and selling them to you for $4.99 at the nursery. And so for you to control your pests in your garden with. So do they work? Everybody's going to be calling you up and saying, well, so do the lady beetles work? Do they work? Do they work? Well, the university's official position on this for many, 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 many years was, no, they don't work. They fly away right away. And I would get up in front of master gardener classes and say, no, they don't work. They fly away right away. And then there'd be somebody in the back of the room and say, but I tried them and they worked. And this happened quite a few times. But this is the reason one of the reasons I like to do master gardening classes, because I always learn something, and if I hear something enough times, I think, maybe they're right. And so we looked through the literature, and we found out that, in fact, there'd been quite a bit of research way back in the 1920s showing that the lady beetles flew away, but nobody really checked to see whether aphid populations were being reduced. So we did some research because we were going to show that lady beetle releases did not work to back up the University of California position. And we got some roses in pots and chrysanthemums in pots, and we got some really dense aphid populations. And we released fairly high numbers of lady beetles, 30 to 60 lady beetles per plant at dusk, and giving them a honey water spray meal before releasing them, because these guys are really dehydrated when they're overwintering and when they've been in the refrigerator at the nursery for 3 months. It was interesting to see that 90 to 95% of them were gone in 24 hours. But the 5% that stuck around actually did clean those plants up. And so they certainly did have some impact. They didn't lay any eggs. So this is not what I would call a persistent pesticide. It's like a soap, it's there and then it leaves. But they did clean those plants up. One of the things that was interesting, when they flew away, they really flew away. We put little markers on them, and so we could tell whether they were flying to other plants in our plots, and our plots were about as big as this room. And none of them that were marked flew to other plants in the plots. They were flying way away. So they're not flying to other plants in your garden. They're flying on the other side of town. So the idea of having them sort of spread naturally through your garden after release didn't seem to be too promising. So what do we say about lady beetles? They can do some good. They're hard to use. Most of them will fly away. If you're going to use them, do release them at dusk. And you have to really put them on each individual plant. Also, you have to have pretty high numbers of aphids to keep those lady beetles there, I believe. If you just have a few aphids, it won't work. So in the long run, you're probably better off spraying them with soap or water. But lady beetles are fun. The convergent lady beetle has many different spotted forms. You can't tell this lady beetle by its spot. So I have people say, oh, well, it's the males that don't have spots, or it's the females that don't have spots, or the ones without spots have just come out of their pupa or something. Yeah, none of that's true. It's just, normal genetic variation. Okay, another predator, a very common predator of aphids, are syrphid flies. And this is the adult of the syrphid fly. The adult feeds on pollen, maybe a little nectar. It doesn't feed on aphids. It's not a predator as an adult. It's a fly. Looks sort of like a wasp. People see it hovering around their flowers. It's got the striped abdomen, sort of like some wasps do, but it's not a wasp. Only has 2 wings. And it has a very distinctive hovering quality about its flying. They often require a pollen meal before they lay eggs. That's why they hang out by flowers. Certainly will increase their egg-laying capacity by feeding on pollen. This is the larva of the syrphid fly. And this is the stage that feeds on aphids. Primarily it feeds on aphids, so it's a fairly dedicated feeder like lady beetles. A lot of people look at this and say, oh my God, I got a caterpillar on my roses, I'll squash it. But first of all, there's no holes in that leaf. And if it was a caterpillar, there would be holes in that leaf. Also, there's a lot of aphids on that leaf. But the syrphid fly, it's a fly, and so it's a maggot, and it doesn't have true legs in the front on its thorax like a caterpillar does, and it has no prolegs on the back. and you can see that it's pointed here at the tip. So that is a syrphid fly. But look twice before squashing the caterpillar. This is a syrphid egg laid in a colony of aphids. Since you know that aphids don't lay eggs during the growing season, if you see an egg in there, it's probably a predator that's been, the egg's been carefully placed by its mother. This is a soldier beetle or leatherwing, a cantharid. This is a predator of aphids. You see it a lot on flowers. I think it eats some pollen, but primarily it's a predator. It has sort of a pest-like look to it, and so a lot of people see these on their plants and think they're pests. In the larval stage, it lives in the soil and is also a predator on soil insects. These are have people seen these in their gardens?
Yes.
Very common. Did you realize they fed on aphids?
No.
Yeah, some did, some did. Okay. We talked about the green lacewing before. This is a green lacewing adult. The green lacewings feed on aphids, but also feed on lots of other things. The larvae of the green lacewing here actually feeding on an aphid. Again, when they come in on their own, they can be useful predators. They're certainly an important part of the predator complex. Lacewings are sold for controlling aphids. I haven't had any success with them, so I don't recommend them. I did the lady beetle experiments to prove that lady beetles didn't work. I did the lacewing experiments to prove that lacewings did work, but we really, things worked out differently. We weren't able to get them. The eggs of lacewings are really neat. They're laid on stalks like this and so you can see them. I mean, you spot them easily even though they're small eggs. And this is on asparagus. This asparagus is actually really infested with asparagus aphid. It's hard to see them on there. But the stalks may protect them from predators like ants that really like to feed on them, but it gets them a little bit out of the way there. Parasitic wasps, those little mini wasps, are very important in aphid control. All the aphids have parasitic wasps that attack them. And after the parasite begins to pupate within the aphid and the aphid dies, it forms a crusty mummy, the dead aphid. So the aphid skin is turned into a mummy. And you see these when you have dense populations of aphids and haven't used pesticides quite frequently. This beige kind of mummy is very common. There's another family of parasitic wasps which turn the aphids black, the aphidinidae. This one, you can see that the parasite has emerged, cut a little hole, circular hole, and emerged. And so again, when we were talking about the parasitic wasps earlier, remember we said you need to be looking, you don't see the little wasps that much, you need to look for signs, usually the pest itself looking kind of weird. And this is a perfect example, the aphid mummy. So, IPM for aphids, no, they don't kill trees. They cause aesthetic damage. You can sort of relax, and perhaps that will be enough so you know you don't need to spray. You can choose plants that don't have aphid problems. Natural enemies are abundant and common and often do significantly reduce the populations. They love lush vegetation, and if you over-fertilize, if you prune at the wrong time of the year, you'll see more aphids than you want to see. Aphids die out, most of the aphids die out in hot weather, so you can often wait them out. Those that are hot weather aphids, you don't see them in the spring. So most of them have fairly short periods of time when they're a problem. Hose them off, prune them off, and if you need to use an insecticide, use a soap or an oil. Now here's another group of insects that's related to aphids. People know what these are? Scale insects. This is the San Jose scale. Actually, there's a number of different stages of this scale here. This is this flat, round, big one is the mature female scale. This little oval one is an immature male. These little yellow things are the crawlers. These are scales that have just hatched out of eggs. The San Jose scale is an armored scale. When you're talking about scales, there's two groups of scales, the armored scales and the soft scales. The armored scales, like the San Jose scale here, are flat and small and relatively inconspicuous, and they can cause severe dieback of tree branches if they're heavy. The soft scales are, these are soft scales on a twig here. They're larger, they're more bulbous, and they're more noticeable. The soft scales produce honeydew, like aphids do. So you have a lot of sticky honeydew. You have black sooty mold growing on the honeydew that's associated with it. The soft scales actually aren't as damaging as the armored scales in many cases. So it's important to differentiate the two groups of scales and then the scale species within. There is a good pest note on scales that if you have scale questions, I recommend you take a look at that. Also good section on it in the Pests of Landscape Trees and Shrubs. But I'll review some basics here. So for thinking about an IPM program for scales, you need to be able to recognize the life cycle and the life stages of scales. It's kind of an unusual life cycle, and a lot of people don't even recognize them as being insects because for most of their life they don't have antennae, they don't have legs, they don't move. They're just sort of weird looking. They do have a lot of natural enemies. And parasitic wasps can be important in the control. And so you'll see those little exit holes in the dead scales to indicate parasitization. The best way to control scales on trees that lose their leaves, and scales are a pest primarily of trees, woody ornamentals. There are a few on greenhouse plants, but brown soft scale. But generally in the garden, they're not a problem on herbaceous plants. They're a problem on woody ornamentals. If they lose their leaves, the easiest and probably best way to control them is putting an oil spray on during the dormant season. During the dormant season, most of the scales are in a small second nymph stage. With the leaves off the trees, you can get pretty good coverage so that you can smother those little scales. For trees like citrus that don't lose their leaves in the winter or any time, you're going to have to time your applications more carefully to catch those little crawlers, the stage that has the legs on it, in season, and then again use the insecticidal oils. Sometimes if your trees are really dying with the armored scales, you may have to apply something more toxic with the dormant oil. I say an OP here now. We're trying to move people away from OPs, so it might be either 7 or a pyrethroid. The life cycle of scales. Where to begin? This is an armored scale. Does it begin with the egg or the chicken? Let's begin with mom. This is mom. Mom is a female blob under the scale shell, really. And the eggs she lays her eggs under her scale shell, so you can't actually see them. The eggs hatch, you don't see them, the eggs hatch out unless you flip over the scale. The eggs hatch out into this little crawler, and you remember this is the freeze stage of life, probably lasts about 24 hours. They have legs, they have antennae, they have sensory organs. They can run around and find the perfect place to feed, and they find it and they stick in their sucking mouth parts, start sucking their juices out, and lose their legs and antennae and start building up a cap or a scale covering. And after that, when they molt, they can move some, but not very much. With the female scales stay round until they get up to the mature stage. The males, not of all scales, this is either the San Jose scale or the California red scale, the males are oval. Now the male actually turns into a winged insect, and he ends up having antennae and legs in the end, so he can fly around and find the females to mate with. So it's a complex life cycle. The soft scale has the same stages. Looking at it from an annual point of view, most, but not all the soft scales, like brown soft scale is a good example, but most of the soft scales only have one generation a year. The armored scales, those flat scales, tend to have a number of generations a year, maybe four or five, and that's one reason why they can become much more serious pests. So the soft scales will be overwintering right now as small second instars on twigs. If there's no leaves on the trees when the spring starts the trees growing just about now, they'll really grow very fast into bulbous mature females. Mating will go on. Eggs will be on the underside, and then sometime around May, depending on the species and the weather, the crawlers will hatch out and move on to the leaves. It all depends on weather. All insects develop according to temperature. So in warmer parts of the state, they'll grow faster, or warmer times of the year. Here we have a soft scale female. We flipped her over, and you can see those eggs. Her whole body has been turned into the next generation. And so we're telling people to treat those little crawlers, and they're so tiny. How do we know when they hatch out? Because you have to be very precise. There's only like a week-long window there where you can actually get them. Well, what we tell people to do is start looking at the scales in the spring. You know, when they get bulbous, you can flip over a few females, see if the eggs are underneath there. But then in the spring, put some double-sided sticky tape on twigs. That's that craft tape, you know, Scotch double-sided sticky tape in the yellow container. Put a flag on it so you can find it, and come back every week and check your sticky tape. And when the scales hatch out, they do hatch out basically at the same time. You'll come back and you'll see all the scales, little crawlers stuck in the tape. And then when you get a whole bunch of crawlers stuck in the tape, that's the time to spray. Now that doesn't tell you that you need to spray. If you only have a few scales on your trees, soft scales particularly, you don't need to spray. It just tells you when to spray. To determine if you need to spray, but you need to be really looking at the overall population of the scales, if there's a lot of natural enemies, if there's damage occurring. If you just have a few scales and you see natural enemies there, it's probably fine, especially with soft scales. Here's a parasitic wasp laying its egg inside an armored scale. This is the citrus red scale, the California red scale on citrus. But again, you don't see the little parasites. What leads you to know that there's parasitic activity is usually you'll see emergent holes. This actually here you can see this is out of focus, but this scale, which should be yellowish, is turned black, and that one's parasitized. That's a brown soft scale. And management of scales, soft scales in particular, control of ants can be very important because the parasites are important and the ants protect them from the parasites. This is a cabbage looper, a typical leaf-feeding caterpillar, feeding away there. One thing about the honeydew producers, those sucking insects like aphids and soft scales, produce all that sticky honeydew and sticky excrement. The chewing insects produce the drier, more pelleted kinds of excrement, and so here we have the looper staring at its pellets. but when the bug's not there, that's one way to get an idea of what caused the damage. There's nothing more distinctive than those huge hornworm droppings under the tomatoes. You can't find the hornworm, but you see the holes and you see those huge, interesting pellets. Leaf-feeding caterpillars are really fairly easy to manage, and also they're not always that damaging. So when you're thinking about integrated pest management for leaf-feeding caterpillars, well, in the cabbage looper can be kind of annoying because it's eating your entire cabbage, which you were intending to eat yourself. But on something like an ornamental tree, and even on a fruit tree where you're trying to harvest the fruit, not the leaves, you can tolerate a lot of defoliation. People are often shocked at how much defoliation you can tolerate. A healthy tree can tolerate complete defoliation every year, early on in the year, without serious damage. Every few years, I should say. And so it's really, in fact, part of the evolution. You take a look at the relationship of the oak trees and the oak worm, for instance, and the oak trees that have the live oaks that have the very tough leaves that are very hard to decompose in the soil. And I can remember on my qualifying committee for my PhD, that was one of the questions from the botanist was, what is the role of the California oakworm in the recycling of nutrients in the oak ecosystem? And obviously, if you didn't have the oakworm digesting those leaves and breaking them down, it would take a lot longer for the nutrients in the leaves to get back into the soil and back into the system. And so this is something that has evolved and that has benefits, and the oak trees really can handle being defoliated every 3 or 4 years as they are naturally in nature. There's quite a few natural enemies of leaf-feeding caterpillars. They're out there exposed to predators and parasites, and so do experience a lot of biological control. Generally, in terms of pesticide sprays, the only thing you really should need to use in the garden is Bacillus thuringiensis for the leaf-feeding caterpillars. But you need to understand that the caterpillars have to eat it, and that it's most effective when the caterpillars are young, and that it breaks down very rapidly. That means you need to be out there monitoring. You need to know, you need to be applying it right after the eggs hatch. The caterpillars are pretty small, and you need to get good coverage so those caterpillars will be feeding on it. For caterpillars that feed inside of fruit, it's a totally different story. Now, these things are hard to manage. And unfortunately, they're also the most serious pest. We have here the codling moth in the apple. There it is. The rest of it's all the frass, or the excrement of it. But this guy, he's here, and he's safe. You can put the most toxic pesticide you want on this apple, and it's not going to bother him. There's no little parasite that can stick its stinger all the way down there and get him. That caterpillar is really very well protected. And the problem is, of course, is that you wanted to eat this apple, and so this is really a significant pest for you. The only time, there are many fruit-feeding pests like this. The oriental fruit moth is one. You've got the corn earworm. Once it gets inside the corn ear, forget it. You can't control it once it gets in the corn ear. It's you can chop off the tip of the corn. That's the management technique. If you want to control it with a pesticide, you have to catch it between the time it hatches and the time it bores into that fruit, which often is a very short window of opportunity. And in the case of a codling moth, it's usually probably less than a day. And so we have here a cute little codling moth, freshly hatched from an egg, the round disc-like eggs which are laid on the leaves. And so you have a very short period of opportunity for controlling this pest. So if you're going to use a pesticide, and they don't all hatch out on the same day, unfortunately. They'll hatch out over a couple of weeks period of time. So you can't really use one of those pesticides that breaks down in 24 hours because you have to have a residue there for these caterpillars to be exposed to for over a couple of week period. And so that's one reason why I say, well, for codling moth, if you're going to use a pesticide, you're going to have to use a persistent one. I mean, you can put an oil treatment on, but you'd have to repeat it every few days to get these hatching caterpillars. So the very persistent material, like 7, would stay on the leaf and be toxic for 3 or 4 weeks to these hatching caterpillars. However, it'll also be toxic to natural enemies of other pests and honeybees. Probably what I do recommend is that people consider an integrated pest management program that doesn't involve pesticides, but some people do want to use pesticides, and that's fine. The pest note for the codling moth is a pretty complicated insect, and when you get questions about that, I do recommend you just photocopy the codling moth pest note and send it out. One thing to remember too is that you can cut the worm out of the apple. But some of the, and back there 200 years ago, they were cutting the worm out of the apple. I can assure you that. Because the biological control of the codling moth, people have been, apples originated in China, and the codling moth originated in China too. But some natural enemies have been brought in, but we've never found one that really worked very well. That was one of the big issues. The entomologists couldn't wait till we could have more trade with China so we could get their natural enemies. But there was quite a lot of political détente about bringing natural enemies out of China into the United States. An interesting story. But anyway, some of the non-chemical ways of controlling IPM that could be combined into an integrated pest management program include fruit bagging. You get a paper lunch bag and put it around the apple that is just the newly formed apple. Just put it around there with a little tie around it, and that'll keep the codling moth out until just leave it in there, and when it's time to harvest the apple, it'll be in there in the bag. People do this. Actually in Japan, this is done regularly on the commercial orchards. Trunk banding, the codling moth, when they pupate in the soil, or they pupate near the soil in the trunk, and so they climb down. They either drop off the tree and climb up, or climb down the trunk. And if you have a band of corrugated cardboard around the trunk of the tree, many of the codling moth will choose that as a pupation place. You put that around the tree at the time that the caterpillars are coming down to pupate on the first generation, and pull it off and burn it before they have a chance to emerge. You get 20% with that method, and you combine it with other things. Pheromone traps. I talked about how the pheromone confusion has been useful in the orchards, where they inundate the whole orchard with the pheromone for the codling moth. But in a backyard tree, you don't have that big concentration, and so you always have moths coming in from your neighbor's trees. But you can get some control by hanging the pheromone traps, which you can buy at the nursery, and catching the males, and they have sticky surface on them, and you catch all the males in there, and then there's less males to mate with the female. That'll reduce the population some too. Chemical control, again, if you're going to apply it, and especially if you're going to use a less persistent material, it has to be applied just when the eggs hatch to be effective. So it's hard to manage the codling moth. Can you see that? What? Sort of? Just barely. Okay, we're going to talk about borers now. insects that bore into trees. And this little guy is a little borer. It's a little beetle. This is a shot-hole borer, which is in the bark beetle family. But there are quite a few different insects that bore into trunks of trees and branches of trees. But they all cause similar kinds of symptoms: wilting, death of trees, dieback, holes in trunks and branches are associated with borers. With many of them, you see some kind of sawdust or sap coming out of the holes. But in order to confirm that your problem has been caused by a particular kind of borer, you got to find the bug, because there are so many different kinds of borers that occur. And also, if it's just a general dieback of the tree, other things other than insects could be causing the problem. And actually, the fact of the matter with borers is usually by the time you have borers in your tree is so sick that you should probably be pulling it out anyway. Borers are secondary pests that come into stressed trees. And usually there's not a whole lot that can be done to manage the problem once the borer is in there. The thing that you need to do is to prevent the borer problems by keeping your trees healthy in the first place. Although you have to realize that some trees, like a lot of fruit trees, have a limited life, 30 years or something like that. Birch trees have a limited life. And they get old age and they get borers. But borers attack stressed trees. And how can they be stressed? A lot of times it has something to do with irrigation, either too much water or too little water. Often associated with the too much water would be a root disease. And so the tree has lost its natural, usually the tree has got a lot of fluids going through which actually repel borers' attack into their trunk. And when they're stressed out, they don't have that natural repellency. Other things would be root and soil compaction. A lot of times trees are very stressed during construction, or people are running their trucks into it, or running machinery over them, and it just stresses them out. Poor growing sites, sunburn. Borers are really associated with sunburn, particularly on young fruit trees. You should protect the young fruit trees with a latex paint from sunburn, because you get sunburn, the borers will go right in there. Also, if you prune a tree drastically, or if something is removed that used to be shading the tree, particularly if it has a thin kind of bark, you can get sunburn on the bark, and then the borers will move in. As I said, there's a lot of different kinds of insects that bore into trees, include quite a few different groups of beetles, including the bark beetles, like that little shot-hole borer I showed, and also the bark beetles in pine and fir trees. The flat-headed borers are big guys, and the round-headed borers are even bigger guys with long antennae. Clearwing moths are a moth group, and these are some other moths that would bore into trees. So there's quite a few different types of insects. This is the shot-hole borer again. It's a common pest of fruit trees, particularly stone fruits. That little borer, and it causes lots of little holes, and sap comes out of them. And again, this guy, it attacks trees when they're getting older or when they're sick from disease. It can't be treated. We don't recommend it be treated. The tree should be taken out before these beetles can move on to other trees. Don't confuse those holes with these, which are actually birds have been feeding through their pecking way. These are the larvae of that little shot-hole borer. Actually, maybe a different bark beetle, but this is a flat-headed borer. Again, flat-headed borers tend to attack, and the larvae of the flat-headed borer has got this flattish head. It's really the thorax, sort of key-shaped. This is a big thing. But again, they're attacking stressed-out trees. There's nothing can do to no control we can recommend. And this is very frustrating for people. They hate hearing there's nothing they can do about it but pulling their tree off, but sometimes that's what you have to tell them. These are clear-winged moths. The clear-winged moths, they look a little bit like wasps, but they're Lepidoptera. There's quite a few different species of them that attack trees, the lilac borer, the peach tree borer. There's a number of different species. This is the caterpillar that is living inside the trunk of the tree, growing inside there. The clear-winged moths, there's a little bit more hope for managing them than the ones that are beetles. So if you have a specimen tree or a tree that you really particularly need to save, you can control them sometimes with treatments of nematodes right directly into the hole where they're feeding, and also, or else with a bark treatment with a fairly persistent insecticide. We do have a pest note on managing clear-winged moths, which you would want to refer to. Here's some typical frass at the bottom of the tree associated with a clear-winged moth. So IPM for tree borers, I guess the main thing to remember is that they're primarily a secondary problem. They come in to stress trees. Usually there's not a whole lot you can do except remove the tree and try to protect other trees nearby of the same species that might be attacked. So prevention of stress and injury is the #1 method of preventing this problem. For instance, don't prune when the adults of the borers are active, because if you do prune, usually the adults are active in the spring. So you don't want to prune in the spring because that will provide an entry site for borers. Don't over-irrigate, that stresses trees. Remove the infested trees and the prunings because you don't want to re-infest trees. There are very few biological controls. Insecticides are difficult to use, usually unreliable, and usually not recommended except for specimen trees or special situations. I usually recommend on those types of situations you hire a professional pest control applicator who has access to some a little more effective materials, probably Astro, which is a form of the permethrin. But the timing has to be right, and the person doing it, because you're putting an application around the trunk of the tree, and it has to be, you can't kill the borer inside the tree. You can only kill the adult before it lays egg on the bark, which is usually in the spring. And so that's where you're aiming your treatment for. And it's different with different species, different years. I wanted to say a few things about lawn insects. I got particularly interested in lawn insects because that's what people are buying these bags of diazinon and chlorpyrifos for. Is, well, they're buying them for ants, but a lot of them are buying them for lawn insects too, and they sell them for that purpose. And it really was my impression that there really weren't many lawn pests, particularly in the Sacramento area or even in California at all. Yet a lot of people are regularly treating, on a sort of an annual basis, whether they need it or not, is sort of, they put in the fertilizer, they put in the weed killer, and they put in the insecticide without really thinking. They're doing it because they think this is good for their lawn. But the fact is that insects are not commonly a problem in the Sacramento area and lawns, and yet there's a lot of treatment for them. Most of the lawn damage is due to overwatering or other types of poor care rather than pest problems. And so if we could just get people not to use insecticides except when they had an actual insect problem in their lawns, we'd probably we'd eliminate about 95% of the use of this stuff in our lawns. The way you monitor for insects for the cutworms, the armyworms, the caterpillars, and perhaps the chinch bugs if there was ever a problem with them, is to put some hand dishwashing soap, lemon joy, in a gallon of water, and you just sprinkle it over the area where you think you have lawn insects, and you wait and you watch. And the caterpillars will actually come up to the top, and you can count them. And so we have a treatment threshold in our lawn insect pest note for these pests. Usually it's 15, depends on the species, but 15 caterpillars. If 15 caterpillars pop up, then you need a treatment. And for lawn grubs, which are the larvae of those beetles, don't come up, of the mass chippies, they don't come up in that. If you think, they're the ones that attack the roots, and sometimes you can actually roll the grass back and you see the damage, but you need to dig around and look for the grubs there. We did a little project in Sacramento a couple of years ago. Jody Azulai was working with me on this, and we had a little notice in the Sacramento Bee for about 4 weekends during the summer, asking people to call the Cooperative Extension Office if they thought they had lawn insect problems. And we got over 100 calls from people in Sacramento, and Jody interviewed them over the phone and tried to confirm that they were sure they had lawn insect problems. And then she went out and she actually monitored, using these techniques, these lawns for the insects. And the bottom line is that only 5% of the lawns had insect problems, and these were people who were sure they had insect problems, and many of whom were about ready to treat with diazinon or Dursban. What she did find was, well, sometimes it's hard to diagnose the problem, but the number one reason really was irrigation problems. She was really able to see that, they had areas where one of the sprinkler heads, for instance, was consistently leaking and was killing the area or something like that. There's soil problems, compaction, dog urine, digging animals' thatch. There was fertilizer burn, too much shade. All these things were causes. And so really it's, again, the IPM message of look before you treat. Make sure that's the problem. Keep your lawn healthy. And so it's the IPM ecosystem approach. Plant the best species available. Irrigate deeply and infrequently. I'm sure you're going to have a session on lawn care, and you'll learn about irrigating. And it's not easy, I got to tell you, but it's really important in maintaining a healthy lawn. Don't use too much nitrogen, but you need to use some. You need to aerate the lawn, remove the thatch, and then cut the grass at the correct height for the variety, and that will really reduce your problems. The final pest that I'm going to cover today is everybody's favorite pest. Actually, I think we've talked about it a little bit before, but snails and their cousins, the slugs, are a pest that you'll get lots of questions about, and so they're worth thinking about. We do have a very good, again, pest note on this, which I urge you to study when you get calls on snails and slugs. But snails and slugs are truly a pest that we create a wonderful environment for. You're not going to see snails and slugs thriving out there in the natural Sacramento habitat in the summer of ceanothus, and in the dry summers there would be no snails and slugs thriving out there. The snails and slugs are thriving in our gardens, which we're trying to keep them like, I don't know, English gardens or northeastern gardens or something like that, with all the water, all the green, the shade, the protected places for them to hide. And it's fine. I mean, that's the way my garden is too. But we still can reduce the habitat significantly to reduce the snail problems. And so think about what it is in your garden that is making your snail populations just really get out of hand. The irrigation practices you have, sprinkler irrigation really is going to favor them. If you can use drip in some areas, particularly in the areas that are adjacent to the hiding places, that would be great. That would reduce their ability to slither back there when the sun comes out. Choose snail-proof plants. There's a lot of plants that snails either don't like or that can tolerate snail damage. That's my strategy in my garden. Hand picking, you really can be vigilant with snails and slugs. Snails are a lot more fun to pick up than slugs, but there is always the rubber glove. Trapping can be very effective against snails and slugs, and all of these need to be used together in an integrated program. You're taking off 20% here, 15% here, 30% here with all your methods. But you can get a board and put it on in the garden in a place where you know the snails come, and then every day pick it up and just scrape the snails off into a plastic bag sealed, or a soapy water in a bucket, squash them. But if you keep doing that every day, the populations will be reduced. Beer is often, everybody likes, the idea of trapping snails and slugs with beer is very appealing, particularly if, you know, half the beer's for the snails and slugs and half the beer's for the gardener. It does attract snails, but only attracts them for a couple of feet. So you have to have these gosh darn beer traps so they're all over the place. There's no place for the plants. Also, it loses its effectiveness fairly rapidly. But there certainly has been some interesting research with beer. There's one of my heroes, Whitney Crenshaw, who's an entomologist at Colorado State University. He has done a whole replicated experiment with 10 different brands of beer to see which was the most effective. And you know, and he got some Colorado homebrew to win out. I wonder who financed that research. But but copper bands and barriers, copper, snails and slugs are actually repelled by copper. If they touch the copper bands, they get a little electrical charge, and they won't cross by it. So you can put copper bands around tree trunks like citrus. Often the snails and slugs will go up a citrus trunk. You can put them around a raised bed. In fact, I have a picture here of. So you have them around here. You got your vegetables, which are vulnerable to the snails and slugs up here. And of course, you want to make sure before you plant this lettuce that there's no snail eggs in that soil. So solarize it or do something else to make sure that it doesn't have snail eggs. But the snails and slugs they'll come up there and they'll just stay right under there. They won't cross it. I think there might be some there, but a lot of flowering plants aren't affected by snails and slugs. Baits. So baits can be part of an integrated pest management program for snails and slugs, and in some situations people really do feel they need baits. Baits certainly can help. You can't control snails and slugs successfully just with baits. You have to also work on making the habitat less favorable for them. But in certain parts of the garden where you really have problems, you may want to use baits. The sort of most common bait used is metaldehyde. It's available in many different formulations. And many different brand names. The problem with metaldehyde, well, there's a couple problems with it. One problem is it's very toxic to dogs, and there have been a lot of dog poisonings with metaldehyde. So if you do have dogs, you have to be really careful with that. The other thing with it is metaldehyde actually doesn't kill the snail, it dehydrates the snail. So it's very important the best thing to do is to water your garden, put the bait out, and then don't water your garden again for about 3 or 4 days. Because what happens is after they eat the bait, they get all dehydrated. But if they get a sprinkler, they'll get rehydrated if they get sprinkled on, and they'll just be fine. Some of the formulations of metaldehyde are less susceptible to that problem than others. I think Deadline, for instance. But now we have this new product, iron phosphate. The most common trade name for that is Sluggo. Has become available, and it is not toxic to dogs and seems to be much more benign to the environment, and I would recommend trying to work with that. And then again, I keep reminding you, I always feel like I can't give them the whole story, or it's all so complicated. I mean, that it's hard to cover everything in one talk, but you know, we're slowly trying to cover a lot of the information you need in these publications, so that go consult them when you need them, and also consult all the other information resources that we have talked about.
There was something that we read not too long ago about the euonymus scale. I don't know if that's armored or if it's soft, but that was a pretty resistant scale, and there was some suggestion that we want to throw the
Euonymus. Yeah, that is a tough scale to deal with. I think it's an armored scale, yeah, you can try to, because the euonymus doesn't lose its leaves. It's hard to treat. It is really hard to treat with the on the trees that don't lose their leaves to get the coverage, but you could try it with repeated sprays. Yes?
What about these brown scales that you find in plum trees?
I'm not sure what scale you're talking about. Are they the bulbous kind?
They look like the bulbous.
Yeah, there's probably the Lacanium scale, and that's a soft scale. And they do have a lot of natural enemies. You could try to treat them with a dormant oil spray in the wintertime, but you might look for parasite activity. There could be some on it. If there's just a few of them, it's not a problem. But if there's a whole lot, then you would want to put a dormant spray on.
They feel hard.
Pardon?
They feel like it when you they're hard, but they are soft.
Yeah, I don't know why they call them soft scales. It's and the other ones are called armored scales. It's confusing terminology. Yes, back there.
What is in the big picture of everything? What is science's goal? Is it to eliminate all pesticides from the? I mean, what's the goal? Is it to eliminate all pesticides so that all bugs live together and plants are biologically or genetically changed so that they're resistant? And
so are you asking what the goal of integrated pest management is?
yeah.
Well, the goal of integrated pest management really is to for you to have a garden that you enjoy, and if you're growing food, you're growing food of sufficient quantity and quality that you're happy. It's not to eliminate pesticides, and it's certainly not to eliminate all the pests, because we can, in most cases, we can live with low numbers of most of the pests. So integrated pest management really, and that's why you really need to take the human aspect into there. We sometimes talk about, in agriculture they talk about the economic threshold, and this is, farmers of course are trying to make a profit, and so they want to know, when do I have to treat this pest so I don't lose my shirt, so I can make a profit, and that's reasonable. But in your own garden, you're not trying to make a profit. So what we usually talk about is an aesthetic threshold, and the fact is that for different people have different aesthetic thresholds. Some people can't stand to have a single bug on their plants. Other people, if they know the plant isn't going to be seriously damaged, they don't mind having aphids on the plant. And so we have to work with people's aesthetic thresholds and try to design a management program to meet that. So a management program that is good for you might be different than an IPM program for somebody else who can't stand having any bugs around. Although I really do think an important element is educating people to be able to tolerate some insects, because you can't get rid of them all. And people need to know that they can tolerate insects at a certain level. So that's a really good question. But that's why you can't give people a single recipe, because what's right for one person might not be right for another person's garden.
Well, I guess I live in a peach orchard for a moment, and I live, you know, where you have lots where houses sit on, and I'm surrounded by aerial spraying, and, you know, a lot of us, they fly over helicopters every spring, you know, with fungicides and all kinds of things, and I'm thinking, what?
Are you from Sutter, Yuba County?
Yeah. Yes.
How did I guess?
But you know,
No, it's the fact that you've got all those peach orchards and stuff.
you know, and I feel a little bit like I feel like I'm sort of an ant in an ash tree, you know.
Yeah. Although I have to say, there has been such a change by peach growers. That it is incredible. I mean, it used to be 15 years ago, peaches were one of the most heavily treated crops with insecticides, and now many peach growers are getting away, and in Sutter County too, they aren't using any toxic pesticides, and there's a very good integrated pest management program for peaches, which uses the BT, the Bacillus thuringiensis, and it might be that those helicopters that are flying over are applying this bacterial disease of caterpillars, which is really harmless to people, and actually be useful for you and your neighbors to know that. I would almost think that if it's that close to a housing development, they would have to be using something that's safe. Sometimes they also fly on these pheromone confusants. Pheromones are chemicals that insects put out to attract insects of the opposite sex or to communicate with other insects. And one of the new technologies, which was really taking off in stone fruits and some other crops, is they inundate the orchard with the smell of the female moth. And the male moths can't find any females to mate with, and so no mating goes on, no eggs. And this has really turned out to be an effective management technique for several insect pests, including the oriental fruit moth, which is a key pest in stone fruits. They're also using it for codling moth, which is the apple pest and pear pest. And peach twig borer, they're using it too, some, although they use the BT. And so many growers in Sutter County, too, you probably know Carolyn Pickle if you're, and Janine Hasey too, are involved in these programs, and so things may not be quite as bad as you think. Yes?
Were things different a couple hundred years ago? Because would you not, say like a peach orchard, would you not have this monoculture of an orchard, but you'd have different types of crops? Did that change the way people managed things back then, or was the consumers, you know, you didn't have a consumer market, so you weren't worried about, you know, a wormhole or something?
His question is, back a couple hundred years ago, when cropping situations are probably more diversified, they're probably little patches with different types of trees and plants together where there are less pest problems, and certainly I think things were different. You know, my father's from England, and so I guess, you know, we were all there eating Brussels sprouts. We weren't eating peaches or anything. You know, we didn't have, there were only a few things that you could grow in certain places. I think that people didn't have very varied diets. I think in many cases they didn't have that much, they didn't have as much vegetable or fruit choices as we did because of the way that we now do agriculture. I think that they had probably a lot more hand labor, but certainly, you know, which allowed them to just pick off pests, and I think certainly they were taking more advantage of biological control because they weren't killing it off with toxic materials. But people have been battling pests ever since they started growing crops, sort of been hand in hand, and at various times they used some pretty nasty materials too. Remember the lead arsenic days, and that wasn't so long ago. That was, well, I guess it was 70 years ago, 70, 50, 60 years ago. Okay, well, that was an interesting discussion. Yes, one more question?
Is the cushion scale part of this family?
Codney cushion scale is a scale, but it's actually neither a soft scale or an armored scale. It's a little separate little family of scales, but it is in the scale group. But do you have cottony cushion scale? Do you have flowering bamboo or citrus?
I had it on a palm.
On a palm?
A pine.
Oh, a pine?
Yes.
Did you get that identified
Yes, it did.
by the Ag Commissioner's office?
By a master gardener.
Because I don't think cottony cushion scale goes on pine. So it might have been a mealybug, but I'd be interested in seeing that.
I could probably bring some in.
Yeah, because I would take another look at that, because cottony cushion scale doesn't go on pine. There might be a similar looking creature. Any, yes?
You mentioned earlier using merit, injecting merit for, and I can't remember what it was.
Aphids and soft scales.
Would you use it? Would that be effective on scale?
Merit is effective on some scales, I think primarily the soft scales, and that's a soil injection. Yes?
I have a neighbor who's using it on their eucalyptus, red gum slugs.
Yeah, some people are talking about using the merit, which is also called imidacloprid, for various sucking kinds of insects. That's the one that you would use a soil injection before the problem occurs. It's taken up in the plant. And yes, it is being used for the eucalyptus lurpsillid. People at the university aren't completely convinced that it's that effective. Its effectiveness is fairly short term, but certainly the tree guys are using it because there's nothing else to use. We really feel that the long-term solution is going to have to be biological control. But there's not much else you can do. The other thing is trying to nourish your trees along. Okay, actually I'll ask her.
Many people have garden services or home services that spray around the home for bugs next to your home. What effect does that have on the ecosystem of your garden?
Well, that's a good question. She's asking about the services that come, and I assume that these are mostly the people who are putting the perimeter treatments around your house for ant management, and how does that affect other insects perhaps in your garden, particularly the beneficial insects? That's a good question. But first of all, why don't we start from whether it's worth your while to pay somebody to do a monthly treatment with a pyrethroid around the perimeter of your house for ant control? And the answer is no, it's not. It's not a very effective ant management method. So even if it doesn't impact but it is a very popularly sold ant management method. Really, if you want to manage ants, you need to find a pest control group that takes a little more integrated approach, which would involve baits. The perimeter treatments are not, what they do is they keep the ants out of your house temporarily. Sometimes they trap them in your house. But what you want to try to do is get at the colony. What they do is colonies of ants are huge, with hundreds, millions of individuals, and those are just killing each individual worker maybe as it walks over it until it dies off. What you want to do is you want to get the poison down into the colony to kill the larvae and the queen, and so a baiting strategy is a much more effective strategy. The other thing is they need to take the integrated approach. Why are these ants coming into your house? And maybe they're not even coming into your house. A lot of people are getting these treatments and they don't really have an ant problem, but it's sort of a habit. But it might be that you have a honeydew problem next to your house or something like that. I do recommend you take a look at the ant pest note, which does cover that. The product that it used to be that Dursban and Diazinon were used a lot for those perimeter treatments, but now they're being pulled off. So the primary materials, and those had, of course, we know that they're getting into the water, and the foundation of your house, when it rains and you've applied those materials, it washes off and goes directly down into the storm drain and is those kind of ant treatments are a real major contributor to the aquatic aquatic water quality problems we have. The materials that they've replaced are the pyrethroids, and so those are getting washed down too, and really the jury is still out in terms of what kind of impact they're having, but I would be very concerned about them, especially if they're not doing any good.
Well,
Yes?
in that same vein, I live in Folsom on the edge of an oak forest, and 3 weeks ago, carpenter ants appeared by the quadrillion, and they were beginning to work their way into the house.
Mm-hmm.
So I called the Pest company, and they said that they would apply boric acid.
Well, she's asking about carpenter ants, and yeah, boric acid is used for carpenter ants. What you want to do is you want to find out where the original nest is. It sounds to me like, you know, they were heading toward your house, but what they're just going to do is put a satellite nest in your house. What you want to do is find the mother nest and treat that. And I think boric acid is a material that is used, and boric acid is actually fairly environmentally benign, and so probably would be a good choice there. And anyway, okay, one more question, then I'll go back to my talk.
Do you at all change any of your recommendations or procedures when you're considering greenhouse plants and pests?
Do we have different recommendations for greenhouse pests? You bet we do, because the greenhouse is a totally artificial environment. There's no natural enemies in there unless you put them in there yourself. So you can't rely on the naturally occurring biological control to do any good at all. Of course, you know, you're able to keep out some pests through that. So the management of pests in greenhouses is completely different. You can, and in the greenhouse, you can purchase natural enemies for release, and you'll probably get better luck with the releases of some natural enemies in the greenhouse than outside, because they can't get out, and you can control the environment better.
Depends when you put them in. Ladybugs die or don't work when it gets hot. So if you do it early in the year, you might. In the summer, they drown.
Yeah, well, it is
anything else besides the ladybugs?
Oh, well, yeah, there's a lot of natural enemies. It depends on what you have. If you have certain mealybugs, there's parasites, and also the Cryptolanus lady beetle. There's parasites for other things. You know, you probably would be interested in taking a look at this Floriculture Nurseries book, because it does talk about a lot of them are grown in greenhouses, and there's a lot of information in there about biological control in greenhouses. So I'd say take a look there.
The preceding program was part 2 of 2 parts, each 90 minutes long. There is support material available at this website, including quizzes, handouts, and lecture outlines for all presentations. Consult the UCTV programming guide for the date and time that other lectures in the series will be shown.
It's the definitive guide to gardening, produced by the University of California. The California Master Gardener Handbook contains over 700 pages of in-depth information on topics such as soil, fertilizer and water management, plant propagation, weeds and pests, lawn care, landscape design, home vegetable gardening, and the wide variety of garden crops that are grown in the Golden State. The chapters in this handbook provide helpful information on selecting varieties, planting, growth cycles, pruning, irrigation, and harvesting. The California Master Gardener Handbook is available along with other gardening publications on the A&R Catalog website at anrcatalog.ucdavis.edu.
Dedicated to serving people, the Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources strives to make life better for Californians in every corner of this fast-growing, ethnically diverse state. No other arm of the University of California reaches out so far to improve the lives of Californians. The division brings together nearly 1,100 research scientists and educators on 3 UC campuses, 9 field stations, and 64 cooperative extension county offices statewide to develop and deliver practical solutions for local problems. Their efforts range from technical farm assistance and water conservation research to nutrition education for low-income families and pioneering advances in veterinary medicine. The University of California's Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources has a library of easy-to-use, practical, research-based videotapes and publications from UC's farm advisors, specialists, and faculty. Valuable information is available for farmers, ranchers, growers, landscapers, educators, homeowners, families, and individuals interested in agriculture and natural resources. Call 1-800-994-8849 to request a free copy of our catalog, or point your browser to anrcatalog.ucdavis.edu for our complete online catalog. There are also dozens of publications available free of charge over the World Wide Web 24 hours a day. At the ANR site, select Free Publications, and you'll see a list of short publications you can download which cover a variety of topics. The information in most titles also applies outside California, and many apply worldwide. You can also find out more about UC's Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources and the wide variety of work it does at danr.ucop.edu.